Chapter 20. It felt good to walk in the shade of the two oak trees. Stanley wondered if this was how a condemned man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all the good things in life for the last time. They had to step around the holes to get to the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden to not want campers digging so close to her home. But several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well, and were of different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sher knocked on the door. Stanley still held the empty sack. "Yes," the warden said, opening the door. "There's been a little trouble on the lake," Mr. Sir said. "Caveman'll tell you all about it." The warden stared at Mr. Sir for a moment. Then her gaze turned toward Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. "Come in, I suppose," said the warden. "You're letting the cold out." It was air-conditioned inside her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat down on a canvas chair. She was barefoot and wearing shorts. Her legs were as freckled as her arms and face. "So what is it you have to tell me?" Stanley took a breath to steady himself. "While Mr. Sir was filling canteens, I snuck into the truck and stole his sack of sunflower seeds." "I see," she said, turning to Mr. Sir. "That's why you brought him here?" "Yeah, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack, and Caveman's covering up for X-Ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten them all by himself." He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. "I see," said the warden again. "The sack wasn't full," Stanley said, "and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole." "In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you go get it for me and bring it here, please?" She pointed to the door. Stanley looked at the door, then at the warden, then back at the door. He slowly walked toward it. It was a kind of dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink he saw a case, white with pink roses. He brought it back to the warden, and she sat it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish, polish remover, and a couple of lipstick tubes, along with other jars and powders. The warden held up a small jar of dark red nail polish. "You see this, Caveman?" He nodded. "This is my special nail polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy that in a store. I have to make it myself." Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would even need to wear nail polish or makeup. "Do you want to know my secret ingredient?" He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. "Rattlesnake venom." With a wet paintbrush, she began to paint the nails of her left hand. "It's perfectly harmless when it's dry." She finished her left hand. She waved it in the air for a few seconds, then began painting the nails on her right hand. "It's only toxic when it's wet." She finished painting her nails and stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her fingers. She ran her sharp, wet nails gently down his cheek. He felt his skin tickle. The nail on her pinky had just barely touched the wound behind his ear, and a sharp, stinging pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. "So you think he stole your sunflower seeds?" "No, he says he stole them, but I think it was—" She stepped toward him and struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the redness was caused by the nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed and clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling off the hearth and onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. "I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds," Mr. Sir moaned. "And if you must know," said the warden, "I liked it better when you smoked." For a second Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. "I suggest you go back to your hole now." Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles in his face jump and twitch, his body writhing in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. "Is he—" "Excuse me," said the warden. Stanley was too frightened to speak. "He's not going to die," said the warden, "unfortunately for you." Chapter 21. It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked out through the haze of heat and dirt at the other boys lowering and raising their shovels. Group D was the farthest away. He realized that once again he would be digging long after everyone else had quit. He'd hoped he'd finished before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. "He won't die," the warden had said, "and fortunately for you." Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought about his great-grandfather, not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son, the one who was robbed by kissing Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how he must have felt after kissing Kate had left him stranded in the desert. It probably wasn't a whole lot different than the way he himself felt right now. Kate Barlow had left his great-grandfather to face the hot, barren desert, and the warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow his great-grandfather had survived for 17 days before he was rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they found him. When he was asked how he had lived so long, he said he found refuge on God's thumb. He spent nearly a month in a hospital and ended up marrying one of the nurses. Nobody ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard a twitching sound. He stopped mid-step with one foot still in the air. A rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his foot. Its tail was pointed upright, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away, then turned and ran. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It had rattled its tail to warn him to stay away. "Thanks for the warning," Stanley whispered as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would have been a lot more dangerous if it didn't have a rattle. "Hey, caveman!" called Armpit. "You're still alive!" "What'd the warden say?" asked X-Ray. "What'd you tell her?" asked Magnet. "I told her I stole the seeds," said Stanley. "Good going," said Magnet. "What'd she do?" asked Zigzag. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. "Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her." He didn't feel like going into details. If he didn't talk about it, then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, and to his surprise it was nearly finished. He stared at it amazed. It didn't make sense. Or perhaps it did, he smiled. Since he had taken the blame for the sunflower seeds, he realized, the other boys had dug his hole for him. "Hey, thanks," he said. "Don't look at me," said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around from Magnet to Armpit to Zigzag to Squid. None of them took credit for it. Then he turned to Zero, who was quietly digging in his hole ever since Stanley's return. Zero's hole was smaller than all the others. 22. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole and then showered and changed into his clean set of clothes. It had been 3 days since the laundry was done, so even his clean set was dirty and smelly now. Tomorrow these would become his work clothes, and he would have the other set to be washed. He could think of no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. He didn't even get any sunflower seeds. "Guess he likes to dig holes," Armpit had said. "He's a mole," Zigzag had said. "I think he eats the dirt." "Moles don't eat dirt," X-Ray had pointed out. "Worms eat dirt." "Hey, Zero," Squid asked, "are you a mole or a worm?" Zero said nothing. Stanley never thanked him, but now he sat on his cot and waited for Zero to return from the shower room. "Thanks," Stanley said as Zero entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him, and then went over to the crates where he deposited his dirty clothes and towel. "Why'd you help me?" Stanley asked. Zero turned around. "You didn't steal the sunflower seeds," he said. "So? Neither did you," said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand, and it was almost as if Zero were looking right through him. "You didn't steal the sneakers," he said. Stanley said nothing. He watched Zero walk out of the tent. If anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. "Wait!" he called, then hurried after him. Zero had stopped just outside the tent, and Stanley almost ran into him. "I'll try to teach you to read if you want," Stanley offered. "I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not that worn out today since you dug a lot of my hole." A big smile spread across Zero's face. Then he returned to the tent, where they were less likely to be bothered. Stanley got out his box of stationery and a pen out of his crate. They sat on the ground. "Do you know the alphabet?" Stanley asked. For a second he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eyes, but then it passed. "I know some of it," Zero said. "A, B, C, D." Keep going, said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. E, F, said Stanley. G, said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his mouth. H, I, K, P, H-I-J-K-L, Stanley said. That's right, said Zero. I've heard it before. I just don't have it memorized exactly. That's all right, said Stanley. Here, I'll say the whole thing, just to kind of refresh your memory, and then you can try it. He recited the alphabet for Zero. Then Zero repeated it without a single mistake. Not bad for a kid who had never seen Sesame Street. Well, I've heard it before somewhere, Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing, but his big smile gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had to figure out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper and took another piece for himself. I guess we'll start with A. He printed a capital A. Then Zero copied it on his sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it more difficult, but Zero's A wasn't bad, just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write smaller or else they'd run out of paper real quick. Zero printed it smaller. Actually, there are two ways to write each letter, Stanley said, as he realized this was going to be even harder than he thought. There's a capital A, but you usually will see a small a. You only see capitals at the beginning of a word, and only if it's the start of a sentence, or if it's a proper noun, like a name. Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew he had made very little sense. He printed a lowercase a, and then Zero copied it. So there are 52, said Zero. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Instead of 26 letters, there are really 52. Stanley looked at him surprised. I guess that's right. How'd you figure that out? He asked. Zero said nothing. Did you add? Zero said nothing. Did you multiply? That's just how many there are, said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know how Zero knew there were 26 in the first place. Did he count as they'd recited them? He had Zero write a few more upper and lower case A's before he moved to the letter B. This is going to take some time, he realized. You can teach me 10 letters a day, suggested Zero. 5 capitals and 5 smalls. After 5 days, I'll know them all. Except on the last day, I'll have to do 12, 6 capitals and 6 smalls. Stanley stared at him, amazed that he was able to figure all that out. Zero must have thought he was staring at him for a different reason, because he said, I'll dig part of your hole every day. I can dig for about an hour, and then you can teach me for an hour. And since I'm a faster digger anyway, our holes will get done at about the same time. I won't have to wait for you. Okay, Stanley agreed. As Zero was printing his B's, Stanley asked him how he'd figured out it would take 5 days. Did you multiply? Did you divide? That's just what it is, Zero said. It's good math, said Stanley. I'm not stupid, Zero said. I know everybody thinks I am, but I just don't like answering their questions. Later that night, as he lay in his cot, Stanley reconsidered the deal he'd made with Zero. Getting a break every day would be a relief, but he knew X-Ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there might be some way that Zero would agree to dig part of X-Ray's hole as well. But then again, why should he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I need a break so I have energy to teach him. I'm the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds. I'm the one who Mr. Sir's mad at. He closed his eyes, and images from the warden's cabin floated inside his head. Her red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, her flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He suddenly realized where he'd seen the gold tube before. He'd seen it in his mother's bathroom. And he'd seen it again in the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container. KB? KB. He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth silently formed the name, Kate Barlow, as he wondered if it really could have belonged to the outlaw, Kissin' Kate Barlow.